Today we're going to talk about the mysteries of New York and try to understand what might be hiding behind the official timeline. According to the commonly accepted version, the history of the modern metropolis begins in 1613. That was when a ship belonging to a Dutch merchant named Adrian Block reached the shores of the territory we now know as New York. However, the fate of this expedition was dramatic. The ship burned down, leaving the crew at the mercy of the unknown. The crew was forced to go ashore. Official sources claim that the local inhabitants, the Native Americans, showed incredible hospitality. They supposedly helped the captain and his men survive the harsh winter by providing food and even offered technical assistance in building a new ship so the Dutch could return home. The city's history has barely begun, and we're already facing facts that raise serious questions. How exactly could a team of sailors, together with the indigenous population, build a new vessel capable of crossing the ocean? Let's think logically. A 17th century ship was an extremely complex engineering structure. Building one required a shipyard, seasoned dry timber, a forge to make nails and fastenings, fabric for sails, tar, and a wide range of specialized tools. The technologies available to Native Americans at the time were limited to dugout boats or bark canoes. These were light river craft, not seagoing vessels. To claim that people who had never seen blueprints and did not possess European-level carpentry skills could help build a complex sailing ship without proper training or equipment is, to say the least, naive. Could you assemble a car in the forest with nothing but an axe? And help from people who had never seen a wheel? Most likely not. This episode is the first warning sign that we're being told a carefully edited fairy tale rather than real history. Still, the new lands appealed to the Dutch. In 1614, they founded a colony, and in 1625, new families from Holland arrived on Manhattan. In that same year, historians say, a fort was built to protect the settlement. If you also notice these glaring inconsistencies in history textbooks and want to know the truth, subscribe to the channel right now and hit the like button. Your support helps us promote these investigations so we can dig even deeper. Surviving and building a ship already sounds miraculous, but what happened next raises even more questions. We're approaching the moment when a permanent settlement is supposedly founded, and here the scale of inconsistencies becomes truly enormous. If building a wooden ship in the wilderness seems unlikely, then constructing the first permanent fortifications and defensive structures defies all the construction and economic logic of that era. Official history offers an explanation that begins to fall apart like a house of cards upon closer inspection. We are told that the 19th century was an era of an incredible number of illegitimate children. Allegedly, women who gave birth out of wedlock faced such severe social and economic pressure that they were forced to surrender their infants to special institutions, foundling homes. We are shown a world where moral standards were so harsh that mothers en masse abandoned their children simply to avoid shame or starvation. Yet this thesis stands in direct contradiction to human nature itself, and to the maternal instinct, one of the strongest biological survival mechanisms. It is hard to believe the official version that hundreds of thousands of women did nothing but give birth only to immediately hand their children over to strangers, fully aware of the grim fate awaiting them. We are told about the harsh laws of the time. If you had no husband and dared to give birth, you had no right to work or support yourself. And so the system literally twisted women's arms, forcing them to give their children to the state. But this phenomenon of mass child abandonment sharply contrasts with the literature and culture of the 19th century, which glorified family values, fidelity, and entirely different models of behavior. So where did this army of orphans come from if society declared completely different ideals? Was promiscuity truly so widespread that it overflowed every orphanage in the world? The reality hidden behind dry reports looks far more horrifying. There existed an entire industry for redistributing human resources. Children, as soon as they reached a certain age, if they even survived infancy, were loaded onto trains known as orphan trains. These trains carried small human beings across the country, sending them not to loving families, but to workhouses and factories. Child labor became the foundation of the economy of that period. It was either catastrophically cheap or not paid at all. Young workers labored for a bowl of thin soup, deprived of childhood, warmth, and, most importantly, memory. In these orphanages, a process took place that can only be called the erasure of identity. Children who did not know their roots were systematically given rewritten personal histories. Their names were changed, new, often fictional, birth dates and biographies assigned. This was done methodically and everywhere. Why would the state machine expend so much effort falsifying the origins of simple laborers? The answer suggests itself. Breaking the link between generations was necessary. A child whose name and past have been changed will never be able to learn who their real parents were. They become a blank slate on which the state can write any story, no matter how fantastical. These children could not ask elders what had happened 10 or 20 years earlier, because their connection to the past had been artificially severed. And they themselves, due to their age and the trauma they endured, remembered almost nothing. This is how a generation was formed that did not know its true history. A generation with no memory of its lineage. But this conveyor belt for producing memoryless citizens leaves one gaping hole in the logic that cannot be ignored. Where did these millions of children come from if there was truly no one to raise them? We approach the most terrifying and uncomfortable question of the era. What happened to their parents? However, if we move forward to the second half of the 19th century and look at documentary evidence from that era, instead of a shining metropolis, we see something that completely contradicts the idea of linear development. A city that, according to the official version, was already more than 200 years old appears in a strange, almost post-apocalyptic state, as if it had survived some global catastrophe whose traces had not yet been cleared away. To make sense of this frightening demographic anomaly, we must discard familiar school dogmas and consider versions that may sound fantastical, yet are the only ones capable of explaining the scale of what occurred. Where could millions of adults have vanished in the mid-19th century, leaving behind cities full of homeless children? Researchers identify three main hypotheses, each more terrifying than the last, yet each logically accounting for the historical vacuum in which we find ourselves. The first theory is a global cataclysm linked to war or an unknown disease. Perhaps the world experienced a large-scale conflict involving weapons we are not told about, or a pandemic swept the planet that selectively struck the adult population. In such a scenario, parents died defending their families or fell victim to a virus, while children, possessing more flexible immune systems or simply through chance, survived. However, this version has weak points. Where are the mass graves? Where is the memory of a great war or plague? Wars and epidemics usually leave behind heroic epics and collective mourning, but here we see only silence and oblivion. The second hypothesis sounds even more sinister and suggests the deliberate destruction of the adult population. This is the theory of a purge. If we assume that power on the planet was seized by a new force, then the old population, carriers of the previous culture, knowledge, and technologies, posed a threat. Adults who remembered how the world functioned before the catastrophe could have been gathered under the pretext of protection or evacuation and sent to special camps or reservations, from which they never returned. They were eliminated as unnecessary witnesses, leaving only children behind. A child is the ideal material for building a new society. A child does not ask inconvenient questions if no one teaches them to. and accepts any imposed reality as truth. The third version is the most radical, but it explains where such an incredible number of children came from in the absence of adults. This is the theory of incubator origin. Perhaps there simply were not enough adults to naturally reproduce millions of orphans. There is a hypothesis that in the 19th century, technologies for artificial human cultivation were used, so-called test tube children. Special farms or incubators could have produced new citizens to populate empty territories and work in factories. This would explain why many orphans looked alike, had no family ties, and appeared seemingly out of nowhere in large batches. Technologies of the past may have far exceeded what we officially know, and bioengineering could have been one of them. In any case, whichever of these scenarios turns out to be true, war, deliberate elimination of witnesses, or artificial creation of a population, the result is the same. We ended up with a generation without roots. Children who did not know their past became the perfect blank slate. On this slate, the new rulers of the world could write any history, invent any dates and events, and no one could challenge them, because there was no one left to say, "That's a lie, I remember how it really was." Humanity was rebooted. But this theory runs into another visual contradiction. If people, both adults and children, were catastrophically few, then who lived in the gigantic, magnificent megacities that already existed at the time? The archives preserved evidence of something completely impossible, something that does not fit the picture of an overcrowded world. And it's precisely at this moment, when the city was a strange mix of high technology and total ruin, that the authorities decide to launch a project that surpasses all imaginable limits in scale and strangeness. To hide these ruins, level the inexplicable landscape, or finally bury traces of the past, builders and planners begin a massive construction project we now know as Central Park. This project is presented as the creation of a natural oasis, but the methods used resemble a military-style clearance operation. Archival evidence from the mid-19th century confronts us with a paradox that cannot be resolved using official history textbooks alone. If we mentally transport ourselves to the streets of the world's largest capitals of that time, whether St. Petersburg, Paris, or New York in the 1860s or 1870s, we expect to see bustling life. We are told about the Industrial Revolution, about rapid population growth, about overcrowded cities where there is no room to stand. Yet the documentary record paints a picture that feels like a cold breath from a grave. We see megacities that resemble not centers of civilization, but grand sets abandoned by their actors. Vast avenues, designed on an imperial scale, stand completely empty. Majestic squares capable of holding tens of thousands of people are deserted. It looks like a scene from a post-apocalyptic film, where humanity vanished overnight, leaving behind only the stone shells of its achievements. In cities where hundreds of thousands of people officially lived, there is not a soul on the streets during the day. There is no horse-drawn traffic, no merchants, no idle crowds. The silence in these images feels deafening. Buildings of astonishing architectural complexity, cathedrals, palaces, administrative structures, rise over emptiness like monuments to a bygone era, even though, according to the official version, they should have been the epicenter of life. Skeptics and traditional historians often try to explain this phenomenon by the imperfections of early technology. We are told about the long exposure times of early cameras, which supposedly caused moving objects to simply not register on the plates, dissolving into thin air. This explanation sounds convincing until you start comparing facts. There are many photographs from the same years and the same cities that clearly capture crowds of people, parades, and market bustle. If the technology could capture people in one case, why does the main street of a capital look like it has been hit by a neutron bomb in another? Moreover, with long exposure, moving objects leave characteristic blurred traces, ghostly trails. Yet in many panoramas, we see sharp cobblestones and crisp shadows, with no hint of movement. This suggests the streets were physically empty, not technically erased. The atmosphere of these cities is unsettling. This is a world frozen in time. If you compare these barren landscapes with photographs taken just 20 or 30 years later, the difference is enormous. By the end of the century, we see the dirt, the crowding, and the chaos we expect. But the mid-century is sterile emptiness. There is a persistent feeling that these cities were either just excavated and cleaned, or that they stand waiting for new inhabitants after a total purge of the previous population. The grand architecture is there, but the people it was built for are not. The cities stand empty, but look closely at the rare passers-by who do appear in the frame. They look nothing like the builders of these palaces, and their appearance raises even more questions about the official version of history. However, leveling land for the park was only part of a much larger process. If we zoom out, all of Manhattan was undergoing total redevelopment at the time. The island was literally shaved down, destroying its natural relief. Builders removed massive layers of earth, leveling elevation differences. And during this gigantic cutting process, when ground levels were lowered by several meters, objects began to emerge that are even more shocking than the terraforming itself. Beneath layers of soil, structures were found that simply don't fit the official version of a young American city's history. When we begin to compare the level of technology required to construct the architectural masterpieces of the past with the actual living conditions of people in the 19th century, an overwhelming sense of cognitive dissonance arises. This technological gap cannot be explained by simple evolution or economic inequality. What emerges is a picture full of glaring contradictions. On one hand, we see buildings of an almost ancient, monumental level. Perfect geometry, incredibly complex masonry, granite columns weighing hundreds of tons and polished to a mirror shine, and decorative elements that are extremely difficult to reproduce even with modern CNC machines. These structures require deep knowledge of engineering, mathematics, material science, and access to powerful construction machinery. On the other hand, against the backdrop of these cyclopean palaces and cathedrals, we see absolute primitiveness of daily life. The streets surrounding these architectural wonders are often an impassable mess of mud and manure. There is no basic hard paving, no storm drainage system that would correspond to the level of the nearby buildings. People move around in horse-drawn carts, wear simple, often tattered clothing, and use the most basic wooden and iron tools. Official history tries to convince us that it was precisely these people, in bast shoes and with shovels, who built St. Isaac's Cathedral or the Capitol. We are asked to believe that a civilization incapable of laying a proper road and living in wooden shacks simultaneously created masterpieces that have stood for centuries. Logic suggests something entirely different. These cities were not built by this population, they were found. The people of the 19th century look not like creators, but like settlers who arrived among the ruins of a far more advanced civilization. They resemble squatters occupying abandoned palaces whose original function they do not fully understand. They adapt majestic halls to their needs, install potbelly stoves in rooms where a different heating system may once have existed, and build wooden extensions against granite walls. This is a classic post-apocalyptic picture, where survivors make use of the remnants of former greatness, but have lost the technologies that created them. The quality of brickwork and stone processing in old buildings is an order of magnitude higher than in the structures the new inhabitants attempt to build. We see a clear degradation of technology, not progress. The mud on the streets, reaching up to the first floors, may indicate that these cities were buried by soil as a result of some cataclysm, and the new inhabitants simply lacked the resources to fully excavate them. They live atop the cultural layer of a destroyed era, trampling paths through mud past colonnades whose creation lies beyond their comprehension. This contrast between advanced construction technologies and the low standard of living of the population is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that history was interrupted. You might say, these are just fantasies. There is no direct proof of a catastrophe, only circumstantial observations. But what if the evidence lies in plain sight, in the very art of that era? What if the artists of the time were not painting architectural fiction or romantic fantasies, but meticulous documentary chronicles of the aftermath of a catastrophe we have learned to ignore? The mystery becomes even more intriguing when we look at the final chapter of this structure's history. At the end of the 19th century, the Croton Reservoir was deemed obsolete and sentenced to demolition to make way for the New York Public Library. And it was during dismantling, when workers began taking apart the granite masonry, that details emerged which completely shattered the idea of a simple water storage tank. Inside the walls and at the base of the structure, elements were found that simply should not be there according to official blueprints. There exists an entire layer of art that official art history condescendingly labels ruinism or architectural fantasy. We are told that in the 18th and 19th centuries, a strange fashion emerged among artists, depicting majestic ancient structures in a state of total decay, destruction, and abandonment. Supposedly, painters such as Giovanni Battista Piranesi, Bernardo Bellotto, or Hubert Robert were simply talented inventors who deliberately aged intact buildings on canvas or composed imaginary landscapes for romantic effect. But if we discard this imposed interpretation and view their works as documentary chronicles, a completely different and frightening reality emerges. These artists were not fantasizing. They worked like documentarians, recording the aftermath of a global Armageddon that destroyed an ancient civilization. Consider, for example, the works of Bernardo Bellotto. In his painting dated 1723, the Colosseum is depicted. When compared to its modern state, the lack of significant difference in the degree of stone degradation is striking. However, there is one critical detail. In the paintings, the structures are literally submerged in soil, buried under earth and clay, with trees and bushes growing on their vaults. Official history claims that more than 1,000 years passed between the fall of Rome and the time the painting was created. Over such a colossal period, nature should have completely reclaimed the ruins, turning them into green hills, or the stone should have crumbled into dust. Yet what we see is a condition characteristic of destruction that may have occurred only a few decades before the artist's arrival. The vegetation on the ruins looks young, which does not align with 1,000 years of abandonment. This indicates that the catastrophe that turned magnificent cities into ruins happened relatively recently by the standards of that time. Piranesi, who created an enormous number of engravings depicting gigantic ruined structures, is also considered a fantasist. But the sheer volume of his work is so great that if you divide the number of engravings by the years of his career, it would mean he was producing an extremely complex engraving almost every week. This suggests that he may have used some form of optical technology or reality copying methods to manage to document a world lying in ruins. His engravings are not the product of a diseased imagination, but blueprints of a dead world, where tiny people in rags crawl among cyclopean debris, trying to make a life on the bones of giants. Another oddity is that many buildings in these paintings are shown buried under several meters of soil. This is the famous cultural layer, which we are told accumulated as dust over centuries. But dust does not accumulate in meter-thick layers that cover first floors and doorways. These are traces of a flow, a mudslide, or soil falling from the sky. The ruinist artists simply painted what they saw outside their windows, a world after a catastrophe, which new generations were slowly beginning to clear away. They were reporters of their time, leaving us clues we have forgotten how to read. But the catastrophe did not only change the appearance of European cities and bury first floors under clay. If we carefully examine old geographical documents, it becomes clear that the climate of the entire planet was broken instantly, and the consequences of that blow reshaped the map of the world beyond recognition. This theory is supported by what lies hidden beneath the city streets. New York is riddled with an incredibly complex network of underground utilities, tunnels, and vaulted chambers, whose brickwork quality often surpasses that of above-ground buildings from the same era. Official history tries to convince us that early settlers, or even Native Americans, began creating this underground infrastructure, which sounds completely absurd. It's impossible to imagine people living in wooden houses and trading pelts, simultaneously building underground palaces for sewage or transport, using millions of bricks and high-level engineering calculations. Many of these underground spaces were discovered already finished during subway construction or utility installation. Builders simply stumbled upon old tunnels and incorporated them into new systems. All these scattered facts, from the strange first ship to the granite megaliths of the reservoir and underground labyrinths, stop looking like random coincidences. They form a single, disturbingly logical picture that's carefully hidden behind official dates and names. We're on the verge of realizing that the history of one of the world's most famous cities may be a grand falsification. If we expand the scope of our investigation and shift our gaze from European capitals to other continents, we see that the traces of global destruction are not local, but planetary. One of the most striking pieces of evidence that the face of the Earth changed almost overnight is the mystery of the African continent, specifically the Sahara Desert. Official science and school geography textbooks state that the Sahara is an ancient desert that formed over millions of years, and that desertification took place over vast geological epochs. We are told that the green and fertile period of this region ended thousands of years before our era. However, cartographic documents from the 15th, 16th, and even 17th centuries tell a completely different story, and ignoring this evidence is becoming increasingly difficult. When studying old maps of Africa compiled by renowned cartographers of the past, we encounter a shocking discrepancy. In areas where lifeless sands now stretch across an area comparable in size to the United States of America, medieval masters depicted a dense network of rivers, vast lakes, and mountain ranges. Most importantly, these lands were densely populated. The maps are filled with the names of dozens, if not hundreds, of cities. These were not schematic sketches of unknown lands. Cartographers who depicted the coastlines of Europe and the Mediterranean with high accuracy could not have been so grossly mistaken as to draw a flourishing paradise instead of a sandy hell. They recorded the reality of their time. North Africa was a breadbasket, a densely populated region with a developed water system that has now completely vanished. A natural question arises. Where did these trillions of tons of sand come from, now covering a third of the continent? Geologists try to convince us that this is the result of weathering. Supposedly, wind and sun ground rocks into dust over millions of years. But to create such a volume of sand would require mountains taller than the Himalayas, which never existed there. The sand in the Sahara lies in waves, dunes hundreds of meters high. This looks more like the aftermath of a colossal material ejection than natural erosion. It gives the impression that this territory was bombarded, or covered by a gigantic mudflow that brought this soil with it. There is a theory that the sand is soil that fell from the sky as a result of a catastrophe, or sediment carried by a massive tsunami that swept across the entire continent. This explains why modern satellites and radars detect ancient riverbeds and outlines of buried cities beneath the sands. A civilization that existed there just 300 or 400 years ago was literally sealed under a layer of silica. It was an instant death for the region. The climate was broken not gradually, but abruptly. Water evaporated or went underground, vegetation died, and cities were buried. We see the same thing in Siberia and Asia, where old maps mark cities, and today there is only taiga or steppe. It was a single process that affected the entire planet. The scale of the catastrophe was such that it altered the tilt of the Earth's axis, or the composition of the atmosphere, leading to sudden cooling in some regions and instant drying in others. The sands of the Sahara are a gigantic graveyard of the former world, a monument to an unknown war or natural cataclysm that wiped entire peoples off the face of the Earth. All of this comes together into a single picture that was carefully hidden from us, breaking holistic knowledge into fragmented and contradictory pieces in history textbooks. If this overview made you think and look at familiar things in a new way, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. It helps us search for the truth and break through the walls of official lies. Right now on your screen, you see two videos. I won't tell you what they're about, but I guarantee this. Once you watch them, you'll never be able to look at official history the same way again. Click and see you there. All these disparate facts, which at first may have seemed like random coincidences, now, at the conclusion of our investigation, form a single mosaic that is terrifying in its logic. We began with the question of strange collective amnesia, and now we see that this forgetting was not a natural process. Millions of orphans sent by train into the unknown were not merely victims of social upheaval or moral decline. They became the clean medium onto which a new operating system of humanity was written. The severing of generational ties, the physical removal of memory carriers, adults, and the upbringing of children in isolation from their roots is the perfect mechanism for rebooting civilization. Without parents to pass on oral history and knowledge of past technologies, humanity was thrown back, forced to reinvent the wheel among the remnants of spacecraft. Silent ghost cities captured in the first daguerreotypes serve as mute witnesses to the moment when the old world stopped. Grand avenues, palaces, and cathedrals, built using stone processing technologies unavailable to us today, stand like tombstones of a great era. The people we see in the photographs, wading knee-deep in mud among granite columns, are not builders, but survivors. Squatters occupying the empty shells of giants. The ruinist artists, whom official science labeled fantasists, were in fact the last chroniclers who managed to sketch the agony of the ancient world, stretching from Europe deep into Asia and the Americas. Geographical maps showing a flourishing Sahara, where today there are only dead sands, and clay-buried first floors of buildings across the globe confirm that the catastrophe was planetary in scale. A climatic shift accompanied by the fall of enormous masses of soil buried not just cities, but an entire technological way of life. We live on the ruins of a great world that perished quite recently, just a couple of centuries ago. We walk on the roofs of buried civilizations without even realizing it. Official chronology is a screen, a hastily erected facade designed to hide the fact that we are not progressing, but degrading, relative to the level achieved by our ancestors. The most important and unsettling question that remains after grasping this picture is, who pressed the reset button, and why? Was it a natural cycle? An inevitable cataclysm? Or was it a planned act by a controlling force that decided humanity had become too powerful, too free, and too dangerous? By erasing memory and destroying infrastructure, someone ensured control over resources and knowledge, hiding technologies of atmospheric electricity and free energy, leaving us only with wires and the burning of hydrocarbons. We exist inside an artificially constructed reality where history is written by the victors. The history taught in schools and universities is cracking under the pressure of these inconvenient facts. But this is only the tip of the iceberg, only the beginning of awakening. To truly understand how deep this rabbit hole goes, you need to learn more. Two videos have now appeared on the screen that will further change your view of the past and explain other mysteries of our world that we did not have time to cover today. Be sure to watch them to assemble the full picture and reclaim the knowledge that was stolen. Until next time.
Seid gegrüßt, ihr Suchenden nach der Wahrheit. Heute schlagen wir Seiten der Geschichte auf, die lange Zeit zusammengeklebt waren und eine beunruhigende Wahrheit über eine gar nicht so ferne Vergangenheit vor uns verborgen haben. Wir stützen uns auf tiefgehende Analysen von Forschern, insbesondere auf die Arbeiten von Darja Kova, die Licht auf die dunklen Flecken des 19. Jahrhunderts werfen. Das erste Kapitel unserer Reise beginnt mit einer Frage, die absurd erscheinen mag, aber nur auf den ersten Blick. Warum erinnert sich die Menschheit an nichts? Wir sind überzeugt, die Geschichte unserer Vorfahren zu kennen, doch bei genauerer Betrachtung zeigt sich, dass unser Wissen über das 19. Jahrhundert aus Mythen und offiziellen Deutungen besteht, die einer kritischen Prüfung nicht standhalten.